Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Facade. Bruce Taylor adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and reviewed the quarterly reports spread across his mahogany desk. To anyone observing, he was the epitome of a successful suburban accountant, methodical, reserved, and utterly predictable. His corner office in downtown Seattle overlooked the bustling financial district, a testament to 15 years of building his practice from nothing. The framed photos on his desk told the story of an enviable life. Julia Taylor, his stunning wife of 12 years, her auburn hair catching sunlight in their wedding photo, their sprawling colonial home in Bellevue, vacation snapshots from Europe and the Caribbean. What the photos didn't reveal was the calculated precision behind every aspect of Bruce's existence, or the skills he'd honed during 8 years in the British Special Air Service before immigrating to America. Mr. Taylor? His secretary's voice crackled through the intercom. Mrs. Taylor is here to see you. Bruce glanced at his watch, 3:47 p.m. Julia never visited his office unannounced. Send her in. Julia swept into the room wearing a designer dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary. At 34, she maintained the same figure that had first caught Bruce's attention at a charity gala 13 years ago. Her smile was radiant, but Bruce's trained eye caught the subtle tension around her green eyes. Darling, I was shopping nearby and thought I'd surprise you. She perched on the edge of his desk, her perfume, something new and expensive, filling the space between them. Lovely surprise, Bruce replied, though his internal alarms were quietly sounding. Julia despised his office, calling it dreary and beneath her standards. I was thinking, she continued, tracing patterns on his desk with her manicured finger, maybe we should plan another vacation. Somewhere exotic. The Maldives, perhaps. Bruce studied her face. In 12 years of marriage, he'd learned to read Julia's tells. The way she avoided direct eye contact when plotting something, how her voice pitched slightly higher when lying, the nervous habit of touching her throat when anxious. All 3 signs were present now. The Maldives sound wonderful, he said evenly. Though I'll need to clear my schedule. Several clients require attention over the next few weeks. Something flickered across Julia's features. Disappointment? Relief? It was gone too quickly to interpret. Of course, darling. Work first. She stood and kissed his cheek, her lips lingering a moment too long. I'll let you get back to your numbers. After she left, Bruce sat in contemplative silence. 20 years ago, he would have dismissed his suspicions as paranoia. But 2 decades of reading people, first as a soldier, then as someone who'd built a very different kind of business alongside his accounting practice, had taught him to trust his instincts. He opened his desk drawer and retrieved a phone that wasn't listed on any carrier's records. 3 numbers were programmed into it. He dialed the first. Clay, came the gravelly voice after one ring. It's Bruce. I need a favor. Clay Lynn had served alongside Bruce in the SAS before following him to America. Now he ran a legitimate security consulting firm that occasionally handled less than legitimate requests for old friends. Name it. I need surveillance on my house. Discreet. Starting tonight. There was a pause. Everything all right? Probably nothing. But I'd rather be paranoid and wrong than trusting and dead. I'll have eyes on your place within the hour. Anything specific I should watch for? Visitors. Unusual activity. And Clay. Bruce's voice hardened. If you see anything that suggests immediate danger, don't wait for my signal. As evening shadows stretched across Seattle, Bruce maintained his routine with mechanical precision. He stopped at his usual coffee shop, exchanged pleasantries with the barista who knew his order, and purchased his evening newspaper. To any observer, he was simply Bruce Taylor, CPA, heading home to his beautiful wife after another mundane day of managing other people's money. But beneath the surface, every sense was heightened. He noted the blue sedan that had followed him from his office, the way it maintained a precise 3-car distance. He memorized the license plate and the driver's profile. Most telling of all, he observed how the vehicle didn't follow him into his residential neighborhood, suggesting the occupant already knew his destination. The Taylor home sat on 2 acres of meticulously landscaped property, its colonial architecture and iron security gates projecting understated wealth. Bruce had chosen the location for reasons that had nothing to do with status. The elevation provided clear sight lines in all directions. The property had multiple escape routes, and the basement contained modifications that weren't listed on any building permit. Julia greeted him at the door with a martini and a smile that seemed genuine but felt rehearsed. "How was your day, darling?" "Productive." The Morrison account is finally straightened out. They ate dinner at the dining room table, discussing vacation plans and Julia's afternoon shopping expedition. She mentioned meeting her friend Adriana Elliott for lunch, a detail Bruce filed away for later verification. Every word, every gesture was performed with the precision of actors following a well-rehearsed script. But as the evening progressed, Bruce noticed other things. Julia's phone buzzing repeatedly with messages she didn't answer in his presence. The way she excused herself to make a quick call to her sister, a sister Bruce knew was deployed overseas with the Navy. The almost imperceptible tremor in her hands when she thought he wasn't watching. At 11 p.m., Julia announced she was exhausted and headed upstairs. Bruce waited 20 minutes before following, pausing to activate security systems that went far beyond what any residential service provided. The house fell into silence, broken only by the subtle hum of electronic surveillance equipment hidden throughout the structure. In their bedroom, Julia lay with her back to him, her breathing already settled into the rhythm of sleep, or a very convincing performance of sleep. Bruce positioned himself carefully, maintaining the appearance of rest while keeping his senses alert. At 2:17 a.m., his phone vibrated once. A text from Clay. 2 vehicles approaching from the south. 3 individuals. Armed. Bruce's training kicked in with the smooth efficiency of muscle memory. In one fluid motion, he rolled from the bed and retrieved the Glock 19 concealed in his nightstand. Julia didn't stir, confirmation that she'd been awake, waiting. 3 masked figures were about to discover that their intended victim was anything but helpless. Chapter 2. Ghosts of the Past. The foundation of Bruce Taylor's transformation from accountant to apex predator had been laid 15 years earlier in the unforgiving terrain of Afghanistan. As Sergeant Bruce Whitmore of the 22nd SAS Regiment, he'd learned that survival demanded more than physical prowess. It required the ability to think 3 moves ahead while your enemies were still planning their first. That education had begun during a mission that officially never happened. Bruce's 4-man team had been tasked with extracting a high-value target from a Taliban stronghold in the Helmand province. Intelligence suggested the compound held a bomb maker whose devices had killed dozens of coalition forces. What intelligence hadn't revealed was that the mission was compromised before it began. The ambush had been perfect. Bruce's teammates, Clay Lynn, Carrie Bass, and Hugh Wyatt, were pinned down in a kill zone with no visible escape. That's when Bruce discovered he possessed something that separated elite soldiers from legendary ones: the ability to make impossible decisions with absolute certainty. In 11 minutes of controlled violence, Bruce had neutralized 15 enemy combatants using nothing but his sidearm, 3 grenades, and an intimate understanding of human anatomy acquired through years of close-quarters combat training. More importantly, he'd done it while coordinating his team's extraction and ensuring the high-value target survived to provide intelligence that saved hundreds of lives. The official report stated that Sergeant Whitmore had displayed exceptional courage under fire. What it didn't mention was how he'd methodically hunted down the Taliban commander who'd orchestrated the ambush, or what had happened during the 43 minutes Bruce spent alone with the man before backup arrived. Some lessons could only be taught through personal experience. After his discharge, Bruce had parlayed his military experience into something far more lucrative than veterans' benefits. The skills that made him exceptional at locating and eliminating targets in Afghanistan translated remarkably well to helping certain individuals disappear permanently in the civilian world. His accounting practice provided perfect cover. Who would suspect a mild-mannered CPA of being anything more dangerous than a tax audit? For 12 years, Bruce had maintained 2 distinct lives with surgical precision. By day, he managed portfolios and filed returns for Seattle's professional class. By night, he accepted contracts from individuals who required problems to vanish without attracting official attention. His reputation in both worlds was impeccable, built on an unwavering commitment to discretion and results. But 6 months ago, something had changed in his personal life. Julia's behavior had shifted in ways so subtle that a civilian might have missed them entirely. Her shopping trips grew longer and less specific. Her phone conversations ended abruptly when he entered rooms. Most telling, She'd begun asking questions about his work that went beyond casual spousal interest. "Do you ever worry about your clients?" she'd asked one evening over dinner. "I mean, with all that money you handle, don't you think some of them might be involved in questionable activities?" Bruce had deflected with humor, but internally, every alarm bell was screaming. Julia had never shown interest in his professional life beyond the income it provided. Her sudden curiosity suggested someone had prompted her to gather information. The first confirmation of his suspicions had come 3 weeks later. Clay Lynn's security firm had been contracted to provide surveillance for a charity gala Julia was attending. The event itself was legitimate, but Clay's report had included an interesting detail. Julia had spent 37 minutes in private conversation with Frederick Lawson, a man whose name appeared in files Bruce maintained for a very different kind of client. Frederick Lawson was everything Bruce appeared to be, but wasn't. Born into wealth, Ivy League educated, socially connected, and completely lacking in the practical skills that kept dangerous people alive. He'd inherited a trust fund that generated 7 figures annually and spent his time collecting vintage cars and pursuing married women. What made Frederick particularly interesting was his connection to certain individuals who occasionally required Bruce's specialized services. 2 years earlier, Frederick had approached Bruce's legitimate practice about managing some investments. During that consultation, Frederick had casually mentioned his dissatisfaction with his current business partners, a group of individuals involved in moving high-value items across international borders without bothering with customs declarations. Frederick's problem wasn't moral objection to smuggling. It was that his partners were cutting him out of increasingly profitable ventures. Bruce had politely declined to manage Frederick's investments, citing potential conflicts of interest. What he hadn't mentioned was that Frederick's business partners were among Bruce's most reliable clients in his other profession. They paid extremely well for services that ensured loose ends never had opportunities to become problems. The second confirmation had come 5 days ago. Julia had announced she was spending the weekend at a spa retreat with her friend Adriana Elliott. Bruce's subsequent investigation revealed that Adriana was indeed at the spa, alone. Julia's credit cards showed charges at a luxury hotel in Vancouver, and hotel security footage showed her sharing an elevator with Frederick Lawson. But what elevated Julia's betrayal from personal disappointment to professional threat was a conversation Clay had recorded using surveillance equipment Bruce had installed in Frederick's vintage Porsche 6 months earlier. The recording revealed that Julia possessed detailed knowledge of Bruce's client list, including information that could destroy lives or end them. "He thinks he's so clever." Julia's voice had been clear despite the road noise. Sitting in his little office, playing with numbers while he's actually running a murder-for-hire operation. The irony is delicious. Frederick's response had chilled Bruce's blood. "Once we eliminate him, we'll have access to his entire network." Some of those clients would pay handsomely to ensure their secrets stay buried permanently. Julia wasn't just cheating on their marriage. She was planning to leverage his death into a business opportunity. The woman he'd loved and trusted for 12 years intended to profit from his murder. But the recording had revealed something else. Julia and Frederick had underestimated their target completely. They saw Bruce Taylor, mild-mannered accountant. They had no conception of the predator who'd spent 2 decades perfecting the art of eliminating threats with surgical precision. As Bruce now lay in his darkened bedroom, listening to the nearly inaudible sounds of armed men approaching his home, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. For 12 years, he'd maintained a careful balance between his 2 lives. Tonight, that balance would end. The men outside expected to find a sleeping accountant. They were about to encounter something far more dangerous: a killer who'd just discovered that his wife wanted him dead. In the darkness, Bruce smiled. Chapter 3: The Hunt Begins. 3 figures moved through the darkness toward the Taylor residence with the confidence of men who believed they held every advantage. They wore tactical gear and carried weapons that suggested professional training, but their approach revealed critical flaws that would have gotten them killed in any genuine combat situation. They moved too close together, failed to establish overlapping fields of fire, and most damning of all, they assumed their target was helpless. Bruce tracked their progress through the house's integrated surveillance system from his position in the bedroom. The leader, a thick-set man with military-style movement, directed his companions toward the rear entrance. a tactical decision that revealed he'd studied the property's layout. The second man, smaller but more nervous, carried bolt cutters for the security system. The third, youngest of the group, kept checking his phone, suggesting someone was coordinating their operation remotely. From beside him, Julia's breathing remained artificially steady. She was awake, waiting for sounds that would confirm her husband's death. In less than 10 minutes, she would indeed hear confirmation, but not the kind she expected. Bruce's preparation for this moment had begun the instant he'd recognized the threat Julia represented. Every room in the house contained strategically placed weapons, exit routes had been planned and rehearsed, and the basement held equipment that would make the next few hours very educational for anyone who survived the initial encounter. The security system's silent alarm indicated the intruders had breached the rear door. They'd bypassed the standard residential alarm with competent efficiency, but they hadn't detected the military-grade motion sensors Bruce had installed throughout the house. Their heat signatures appeared on his phone's display as they moved through the kitchen toward the main staircase. Bruce slipped from the bedroom with movements so fluid they barely disturbed the air. His bare feet made no sound on the hardwood floors as he descended a back staircase that led directly to the house's service areas. The Glock in his hand felt familiar and comforting, but for what he had planned, firearms would be secondary tools. The first intruder died without ever seeing his killer. Bruce emerged from the pantry as the man passed the kitchen island, moving with the patience of an apex predator. One hand covered the intruder's mouth while the other drove a carbon fiber knife between his fourth and fifth ribs, angling upward to pierce the heart. The man's eyes went wide with shock and pain, but death came too quickly for struggle. Bruce lowered the body silently to the floor, already turning toward his next target. The second man was examining family photos in the living room when Bruce found him. This one was more alert, turning at the whisper of displaced air that preceded his death. Bruce's knife entered just below the base of his skull, severing the spinal cord with surgical precision. The bolt cutters clattered to the floor as the man collapsed, but the sound was muffled by expensive carpeting. The third intruder, the young one with the phone, had positioned himself near the front door as a lookout. He was texting someone when Bruce appeared behind him like a shadow. This death was more personal. Bruce wanted information, so he kept the man conscious for nearly 30 seconds while pressure on specific nerves created agony beyond description. The intel he extracted in those 30 seconds was worth the effort. Julia had hired them through Frederick. Payment was to be made after confirmation of death, and most interesting of all, this wasn't their first such job. With the immediate threat neutralized, Bruce retrieved one of the dead men's phones and composed a text message to the contact listed as F. Job done. Target eliminated. Staging scene now. The response came within seconds. Excellent. Julia is asking for confirmation. Send photo. Bruce smiled as he typed back. Need 20 minutes to arrange scene. We'll send proof once complete. Now came the delicate work of psychological warfare. Bruce photographed the aftermath of the violent struggle that had supposedly ended his life, paying careful attention to blood spatter patterns and evidence of desperate resistance. The images would convince any observer that Bruce Taylor had fought bravely but futilely against professional killers. He placed the dead men's bodies in positions that suggested they'd been wounded during the struggle but had successfully completed their mission. A few strategic gunshots into walls and furniture completed the illusion of a chaotic gunfight. The scene told a clear story. 3 armed men had invaded the Taylor home, killed its owner during a violent struggle, and were now preparing to stage a robbery as cover for their crime. But the masterpiece of Bruce's deception was yet to come. He retrieved Julia's phone from her purse and found exactly what he expected, a series of coded messages between her and Frederick, including instructions for the killers and discussions of payment. More importantly, he found evidence of something that made his blood burn with cold rage. Julia had been planning his death for months, carefully gathering information about his clients and his methods. The most damning evidence was a voice recording Julia had made 6 weeks earlier. She'd hidden a device in his study and captured a phone conversation between Bruce and one of his high-value clients discussing the permanent removal of a business rival. The recording was explicit enough to ensure life sentences for multiple people or serve as leverage for extracting millions in blackmail payments. Bruce realized that Julia's betrayal extended far beyond adultery or even murder. She and Frederick had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to eliminate him, assume control of his clandestine operations, and exploit his client network for their own profit. They'd planned to turn his death into the foundation of their own criminal empire. But they'd made one critical error. They'd underestimated the difference between a professional killer and someone who merely killed for money. Bruce didn't just eliminate targets. He understood the psychology of fear, the architecture of suffering, and the art of making death serve larger purposes. At 3:47 a.m., Bruce sent Frederick the promised photograph, an image showing blood pooled around what appeared to be his lifeless body. The response was immediate. "Beautiful work. Bring confirmation to the usual place. Julia wants to see proof before final payment." Bruce typed his final message as Bruce Taylor, accountant, Roger, en route with package. Then he destroyed the phone and began his transformation into something far more dangerous. From his basement armory, he selected tools and weapons that would serve the next phase of his plan. The mild-mannered CPA who'd built a comfortable life in suburban Seattle was gone forever. What remained was the predator who'd learned his craft in the mountains of Afghanistan and perfected it in the shadows of American cities. Julia stirred upstairs, undoubtedly listening for sounds that would confirm her husband's death. Soon she would have that confirmation, but the revelation would come with consequences she'd never imagined. Frederick Lawson was about to discover that hiring killers and becoming a target were two very different experiences. Julia Taylor would learn that betraying a professional killer was the last mistake she'd ever make. Bruce checked his watch, 4:15 a.m. He had approximately 90 minutes before Julia would expect the killers to contact her directly. That gave him enough time to prepare a reunion that none of them would ever forget. In the darkness of his basement, Bruce began loading equipment into a black tactical bag. The hunt was about to begin. Chapter 4: The Devil's Arithmetic. Frederick Lawson lived in a glass and steel monument to inherited wealth overlooking Elliott Bay. The penthouse apartment occupied 2 floors of Seattle's most exclusive building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city and sound. Security was provided by a combination of electronic systems and a doorman who'd been carefully selected for his inability to remember faces or ask uncomfortable questions. At 5:30 a.m., Frederick stood on his balcony in a silk robe, sipping 20-year-old scotch and admiring the sunrise. The previous hour had been delicious. First the confirmation that Bruce Taylor was dead, then Julia's tears of carefully performed grief when the killers called to inform her of her husband's fate. She was even now playing the role of shocked widow, calling 911 to report the apparent home invasion. Frederick's phone buzzed with a text from one of the hired killers. "Package secured. Ready for delivery." He typed back, "Building service entrance. I'll meet you in parking garage." This was the culmination of 8 months of careful planning. Frederick had recognized Bruce's potential value the moment he'd accidentally overheard him arranging the disappearance of a union leader who'd been threatening one of Frederick's legitimate business interests. Most people would have been horrified. Frederick had seen opportunity. The challenge had been accessing Bruce's client network without triggering his suspicions. That's where Julia had proven invaluable. She'd seduced Frederick at a charity function, but their relationship had quickly evolved into something more profitable than passion. Julia possessed the access Frederick needed, and he provided the vision to monetize her husband's secrets. Their plan had been elegant in its simplicity: eliminate Bruce, assume control of his operations, and leverage his client list for maximum profit. Some clients would pay handsomely for continued services. Others would pay even more handsomely for silence about their previous requirements. The most valuable clients would pay perpetually for both. Frederick descended to the parking garage at precisely 6 a.m. The service elevator opened to reveal a figure in dark clothing carrying a black tactical bag. The man's face was partially concealed by shadow, but his build matched the leader of the team Frederick had hired. "Show me," Frederick said without preamble. The man opened the bag and withdrew an object wrapped in plastic. Inside was what appeared to be a severed hand wearing Bruce Taylor's distinctive wedding ring, still bearing traces of blood that looked convincingly fresh. "Excellent," Frederick breathed. "And the other matter?" "His files are encrypted, but his wife has the passwords. She's already provided access to his client database." Frederick nodded. satisfaction warming him more than the expensive scotch. Perfect. Your payment will be transferred within the hour. Actually, the man said, his voice carrying an accent Frederick couldn't immediately place. There's been a change in the payment structure. Frederick frowned. What kind of change? The kind where you don't get to walk away from this. The voice was wrong. Frederick realized at a heartbeat before the plastic-wrapped hand revealed itself to be an elaborate fake, complete with prosthetic fingers and stage blood. In the same instant, the figure stepped into the light, and Frederick found himself staring into the very alive, very dangerous eyes of Bruce Taylor. Hello, Frederick, Bruce said conversationally. We need to discuss your business plan. Frederick's hand moved toward the panic button on his key fob, but Bruce was faster. A grip like a steel vise closed around Frederick's wrist, applying pressure to nerve clusters that sent lightning bolts of pain up his arm. None of that, Bruce said. We're going to have a conversation about loyalty, betrayal, and the market value of human life. You're going to find the exchange rate educational. Frederick tried to speak, but terror had locked his vocal cords. The man he'd ordered killed was standing 3 feet away, radiating an aura of controlled violence that made Frederick's bladder threaten to empty itself. Do you know what I did for a living before I became an accountant? Bruce asked, maintaining his grip on Frederick's wrist. I solved problems for people who couldn't afford to have those problems become public knowledge. The work required a very particular skill set, patience, precision, and an intimate understanding of human psychology. Bruce increased the pressure on Frederick's wrist by degrees, watching his face carefully. For instance, did you know there are 17 pressure points on the human body that can cause excruciating pain without leaving lasting damage? Or that the average person will begin divulging secrets after approximately 90 seconds of properly applied discomfort? Please, Frederick managed to whisper. Please what? Please don't hurt you? Please forgive your attempt to have me murdered? Please pretend you didn't plan to blackmail my clients and steal my business. Bruce's voice remained conversational, but his eyes held no mercy. I'm afraid none of those requests are reasonable. Bruce released Frederick's wrist and opened the tactical bag fully, revealing an assortment of tools that looked like they belonged in a surgeon's kit, if surgeons specialized in extracting information from unwilling patients. Here's what's going to happen, Bruce continued. You're going to tell me everything about your arrangement with my wife. Every detail, every conversation, every plan you've made for after my death. You're going to give me access to all your communications, financial records, and associates. And you're going to do it quickly, because my patience for this situation is extremely limited. Frederick's survival instincts finally overcame his shock. You can't do this. This is kidnapping, assault. This is justice, Bruce interrupted. You hired men to kill me in my sleep. You manipulated my wife into betraying everything we'd built together. You planned to profit from my death and destroy innocent people in the process. The legal system calls that conspiracy to commit murder. I call it a death sentence. Bruce selected a small, precise-looking instrument from his bag. Let's start with something simple. How long have you been sleeping with my wife? The next hour in the parking garage was educational for both men, though Frederick learned far more than he'd wanted to know about pain tolerance and information extraction. Bruce approached the interrogation with the methodical precision he'd brought to every aspect of his professional life, carefully calibrating pressure and pain to maximize information yield while ensuring his subject remained conscious and coherent. By 7 a.m., Bruce possessed a complete understanding of the conspiracy against him. Julia and Frederick had been planning his death for 6 months, carefully documenting his activities and identifying his most valuable clients. They'd recruited the 3 killers through Frederick's connections in Seattle's underground economy, promising them $50,000 each for a simple home invasion that would look like a robbery gone wrong. More damning, Frederick revealed that Julia had been systematically copying Bruce's client files for weeks, building a database of information that could destroy dozens of lives or generate millions in blackmail revenue. She'd even recorded private conversations in their home, gathering evidence of Bruce's activities that could ensure life sentences for multiple people. But the most revelatory information concerned Frederick's broader criminal network. He wasn't just a trust fund playboy dabbling in murder for hire. He was part of an organized group that specialized in blackmail, extortion, and targeted killings. Bruce's elimination was intended to be their entry into the lucrative world of contract killing, with Julia serving as their inside source for identifying future targets. There's something else, Frederick gasped during a brief respite from Bruce's attentions. Julia has a meeting this morning. With the others. They're planning to celebrate your death and discuss their next targets. Bruce paused in his work. What others? The whole group. Clay Lynn, Carrie Bass, Hugh Wyatt. Your old military friends. They're all part of this. The words hit Bruce like a physical blow. His closest allies, men who'd saved his life and shared his darkest moments, had betrayed him for money. The conspiracy wasn't limited to his wife and her lover. It included the only people on Earth he'd trusted completely. For the first time since discovering Julia's betrayal, Bruce felt something beyond cold rage. The systematic destruction of every relationship he'd valued was so complete, so carefully orchestrated, that it suggested months of planning and coordination. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Bruce's tactical mind began processing the implications. If his former teammates were part of the conspiracy, they would expect him to be dead by now. They would be gathering to celebrate their victory and plan their next moves. That gave him an opportunity for the kind of comprehensive vengeance that would ensure none of them ever threatened anyone again. Where? Bruce asked quietly. Julia's house. Your house. They're meeting there at 8 a.m. to survey the crime scene and coordinate their stories with the police. Bruce checked his watch, 7:23 a.m. Enough time to return home and prepare a reunion that would redefine the meaning of betrayal for everyone involved. He looked down at Frederick, who was barely conscious and thoroughly broken. Thank you for your cooperation. Your information has been extremely valuable. Are you going to let me go? Bruce smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Frederick, I'm going to do something much worse than kill you. I'm going to let you live with the knowledge of what's about to happen to the others. You're going to spend the rest of your life knowing that you helped me identify every single person who betrayed me. He injected Frederick with a sedative that would keep him unconscious for approximately 6 hours, then secured him in his own trunk with restraints that would prevent escape but wouldn't cause permanent damage. Frederick would wake up in police custody, facing charges for conspiracy to commit murder based on evidence Bruce would ensure reached the authorities. But that was a secondary concern. Bruce had more pressing appointments to keep. As he drove back toward his house, Bruce's mind was already calculating angles of fire, entry routes, and the precise timing required to ensure that everyone who'd betrayed him would face justice simultaneously. The mild-mannered accountant was gone forever. What remained was something much more dangerous. A killer who'd just discovered that his entire life had been a lie. The reunion was about to begin. Chapter 5, The Gathering Storm. Julia Taylor stood in her kitchen at 7:45 a.m., playing the role of grieving widow with an Oscar-worthy performance. 2 Seattle police detectives sat at her breakfast table, notebooks open, expressions sympathetic. She'd called 911 at 6:15 a.m. to report discovering her husband's body, and the responding officers had been appropriately horrified by the apparent violence of the home invasion. I can't believe this happened, Julia sobbed, dabbing her eyes with tissues that had been strategically placed throughout the house. Bruce was such a gentle man. He never hurt anyone. Detective Melvin Riggs, a 20-year veteran with kind eyes and a methodical approach to evidence, nodded sympathetically. We're going to find who did this, Mrs. Taylor. The preliminary examination suggests this was a professional job, which means these men have likely committed similar crimes. We'll catch them. Julia's tears were real, but not for the reasons the detectives assumed. She was crying with relief and anticipation. Bruce was dead. The police were treating her as a victim rather than a suspect, and within hours she would be meeting with Frederick and the others to begin monetizing her husband's criminal empire. Did your husband have any enemies? Asked Detective Emmanuel Hogan, the younger of the 2 investigators. Anyone who might have wanted to hurt him? None that I knew of, Julia replied truthfully. He was an accountant. His clients were all wealthy, respectable people. Although, she paused, as if remembering something reluctant to share. What is it, Mrs. Taylor? Well, Bruce had been acting strangely lately, more secretive than usual. He'd been taking phone calls at odd hours, speaking in whispers. I thought maybe he was having an affair, but now I wonder if he might have been involved in something dangerous. The detectives exchanged glances. A law-abiding accountant with a secret life was exactly the kind of case that generated headlines and commendations. Detective Riggs leaned forward. Can you be more specific about these phone calls? Julia launched into a carefully rehearsed narrative that painted Bruce as a man who'd become entangled with dangerous people, possibly through his accounting practice. She mentioned mysterious meetings, large cash transactions, and her growing fear that her husband was being coerced into criminal activity. Every word was designed to establish reasonable doubt about the true nature of the crime while positioning her as an innocent victim. At 8 a.m. precisely, a familiar voice called from the front door. "Julia?" The police said we could come in. Clay Lynn entered the kitchen, followed by Carrie Bass and Hugh Wyatt. To the detectives, they appeared to be exactly what Julia claimed, concerned friends who'd rushed to support the widow in her time of grief. All three men wore expressions of appropriate shock and sorrow. "We came as soon as we heard," Clay said, embracing Julia with practiced comfort. "I can't believe Bruce is gone." Carrie Bass, a stocky man with prematurely gray hair, shook his head grimly. 20 years I've known him. Since our army days. This doesn't make sense." Hugh Wyatt, the tallest of the three, sat heavily at the table. "Has anyone claimed responsibility? This feels like a professional hit." The detectives introduced themselves and began asking the standard questions about Bruce's recent behavior, potential enemies, and financial situation. The four conspirators responded with carefully coordinated answers that painted Bruce as a beloved friend who'd seemed troubled in recent weeks but had never mentioned specific threats. What the police didn't know was that Clay, Carrie, and Hugh had spent the previous 6 months gathering intelligence on Bruce's operations while maintaining the facade of loyal friendship. Each man had specific knowledge of Bruce's client base, methods, and financial arrangements. Combined with Julia's intimate access to his personal files, they possessed everything needed to assume control of his business. Their plan was elegant in its simplicity. With Bruce dead and his operations temporarily disrupted, his clients would need new sources for the specialized services he provided. Clay's security firm could handle surveillance and intelligence gathering. Carrie's import-export business provided perfect cover for moving people and materials across borders. Hugh's connections in law enforcement offered protection from official scrutiny. Julia would serve as the public face of Bruce's legitimate accounting practice while secretly providing access to his client database and financial records. Within 6 months, they projected earning triple what Bruce had generated working alone. But the most profitable aspect of their plan involved the clients they wouldn't serve. Bruce's files contained enough evidence to destroy dozens of wealthy, powerful individuals. Many of those people would pay enormous sums to ensure their secrets remained buried. The mathematics were simple. Dead clients couldn't pay, but terrified clients would pay forever. "We should let Mrs. Taylor grieve in private," Detective Riggs said after 45 minutes of questioning. "But we'll need formal statements from all of you in the next few days." After the police left, the four conspirators dropped their grieving facade. Clay pulled out a laptop and began accessing Bruce's encrypted files using passwords Julia had provided. Carrie and Hugh started examining the crime scene, ensuring no evidence remained that might implicate them in the killings. "Beautiful work," Clay said, reviewing the staged aftermath of the supposed gunfight. "Even Bruce couldn't have arranged a more convincing crime scene." Julia smiled coldly. "He taught me more than he realized. All those years listening to him discuss his work, learning his methods. I absorbed everything." "What about the killers?" Hugh asked. "Frederick was supposed to handle their payment and disposal." "He'll take care of them," Julia replied. "They're loose ends that need to be eliminated anyway. Frederick understands the importance of operational security." They spent the next hour reviewing Bruce's client files, identifying the most valuable targets for their new business model. The database was extraordinary. Politicians, business leaders, foreign nationals, and criminals who'd paid Bruce millions over the years to eliminate threats and bury secrets. "Look at this," Carrie said, pointing to a particularly lucrative entry. Senator Barry Chavez paid Bruce $2 million last year to eliminate a journalist investigating his campaign finances. He's up for re-election in 18 months. "That's exactly the kind of recurring revenue stream we need," Clay agreed. "Chavez will pay whatever we ask to keep that information buried." Hugh pulled up another file. "And here's Alfred Greer, the pharmaceutical executive. Bruce arranged the death of 3 FDA investigators who were examining his company's drug trials. Greer's worth $800 million. He could fund our entire operation single-handedly." Julia watched her conspirators catalog the evidence of her husband's crimes with growing satisfaction. Each file represented not just money, but power over people who'd previously been untouchable. She would transform Bruce's death into the foundation of an empire built on fear and controlled information. But as they worked, none of them noticed the subtle signs that suggested someone had been in the house since the supposed home invasion. A coffee cup that hadn't been there during the police investigation. Furniture positioned slightly differently than the crime scene photos would indicate. Most tellingly, the security system showed gaps in its recording that suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the house's layout had moved through it undetected. At 9:30 a.m., Julia's phone rang. The caller ID showed Frederick's number. How did it go with the police? Frederick's voice sounded strange, tense and frightened. Perfectly, Julia replied. They're treating it as a random home invasion. We're clear. Good. That's very good. I need to see you. All of you. There's been a complication. What kind of complication? Not over the phone. Meet me at the warehouse in 1 hour. Come alone. The line went dead. Julia stared at her phone, a chill of unease running down her spine. Frederick had sounded terrified, which made no sense. The plan had worked perfectly. Bruce was dead, the police were deceived, and they were free to begin exploiting his criminal empire. Who was that? Clay asked. Frederick. He wants to meet at the warehouse. He says there's been a complication. The three men exchanged glances. In their military experience, complications after successful operations usually meant someone had made a critical error that threatened the entire mission. Could the killers have been captured? Hugh wondered. Impossible, Carrie said. They're professionals. They know how to disappear. But as they prepared to leave for the meeting, none of them considered the possibility that their complication had a name. Bruce Taylor. The man they'd betrayed. The man they'd tried to kill. The man whose death they were already celebrating. The mild-mannered accountant was gone forever. But the predator who'd learned his craft in the mountains of Afghanistan was very much alive. And he was about to give his former friends a lesson in the true meaning of betrayal. The reunion was about to begin. Chapter 6. The Web Titans. The warehouse Frederick had specified sat in an industrial district south of Seattle, surrounded by shipping containers and loading docks that provided perfect isolation for conversations that couldn't be overheard. Julia arrived first, her Mercedes looking out of place among the rusted trucks and industrial equipment. The building itself was one of Frederick's legitimate business holdings, a storage facility for imported goods that occasionally held items not listed on any customs declaration. Frederick's Porsche was already there, parked near a side entrance that led directly to his private office. Julia found him sitting behind his desk, but something was wrong. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his face pale and drawn. Most disturbing, his hands shook as he poured himself a drink from a bottle of expensive whiskey. You look terrible, Julia observed. What's this complication you mentioned? Frederick's eyes darted toward the windows before focusing on her face. We need to abort everything. Cancel the entire operation. Disappear. What are you talking about? The plan worked perfectly. Bruce is dead. The police are investigating a home invasion, and we have access to all his files. Everything we discussed is falling into place. No, Frederick said, his voice barely above a whisper. Everything we discussed was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. We didn't kill Bruce Taylor. We killed Bruce Taylor, the accountant. The man who died in that house was just a cover identity. Julia stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. Frederick, I saw the crime scene. I watched the police examine his body. Bruce is dead. The body the police examined was one of the killers we hired. Someone who matched Bruce's height and build, dressed in his clothing, positioned to look like the victim of a home invasion. Frederick's hands trembled as he raised the whiskey glass to his lips. The real Bruce Taylor is very much alive. And he knows everything. The words hit Julia like a physical blow. That's impossible. How could you possibly know that? Frederick opened his laptop and showed her a series of photographs taken in the warehouse's parking garage. The images showed Frederick himself, unconscious and secured in the trunk of his own car. The timestamp indicated they'd been taken just 2 hours earlier. I woke up this morning in police custody, Frederick continued. Someone had called in an anonymous tip about suspicious activity in my building's parking garage. When the police opened my trunk, they found me unconscious with these photographs taped to my chest. Julia examined the images with growing horror. They showed Frederick in various stages of distress, clearly being interrogated by someone with professional knowledge of information extraction. But most chilling was the final photograph. Frederick's face, tear-streaked and broken, with a handwritten note held beside it that read, "Tell Julia the game has changed. BT. He was in the parking garage when I went to meet the killers," Frederick whispered. "He'd already eliminated them and staged their bodies in your house. He interrogated me for over an hour, learning everything about our plan, our associates, our objectives. Then he left me for the police to find." Julia's mind raced as she processed the implications. If Bruce was alive, if he knew about their conspiracy, if he'd already begun taking action against them, why didn't the police arrest you? Those photographs are evidence of criminal activity. Because whoever called in the tip also provided evidence that I was the victim, not the perpetrator. The police found video footage that showed me being abducted from my own building. They think I was kidnapped and tortured by the same people who killed your husband. Frederick pulled up security footage on his laptop. The video showed a figure in dark clothing forcing Frederick into the service elevator at gunpoint. The timestamp matched the period when Frederick had thought he was meeting the killers. "He's been planning this," Frederick continued. "Not just surviving our attempt to kill him, but turning it against us. The police now believe I'm a victim of the same criminals who murdered Bruce Taylor. They're offering me protective custody." Julia sank into a chair as the full scope of their miscalculation became clear. They hadn't been hunting Bruce Taylor, mild-mannered accountant. They'd been hunting someone far more dangerous, someone who'd anticipated their every move and prepared countermeasures that turned their own plan into a trap. "Where are Clay, Carrie, and Hugh?" she asked. "I don't know. I called them after I was released from police custody, but none of them answered. Their phones are going straight to voicemail." As if summoned by their conversation, Julia's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Your friends are safe. For now. If you want to see them again, you'll follow my instructions exactly. Any deviation will result in their immediate death. BT." A second message arrived with GPS coordinates and a time, 1 hour. "Come alone. No weapons, no backup, no police. You have 30 seconds to confirm receipt, or your associates begin dying." Julia stared at the messages, her breath coming in short gasps. Bruce wasn't just alive. He'd captured 3 trained killers, men who'd served with him in combat, men who knew his methods and capabilities. If he could neutralize them so easily, what chance did she have? "We need to run," Frederick said urgently. "Right now? I have cash, clean documents, and a boat that can get us to international waters. We can disappear before he finds us." "He already found you once," Julia replied, her voice steady despite her fear. "He knows everything about our plan, our resources, our methods. Running won't save us. It will just delay the inevitable." She typed a response to Bruce's message, confirmed. 1 hour. "Julia, don't do this. He's going to kill you." "Maybe. But if I don't go, he'll definitely kill Clay, Carrie, and Hugh. Then he'll hunt us down anyway." Julia stood and straightened her clothing, summoning the composure that had carried her through 12 years of marriage to a man she'd never truly known. "Besides, he had opportunities to kill me this morning. The fact that he's arranging a meeting suggests he wants something other than simple revenge. What could he possibly want from you? Information, confession, an explanation of why the woman he loved and trusted for 12 years decided to have him murdered." Julia moved toward the door, then paused. "If I don't return within 3 hours, take your boat and disappear. Don't try to avenge me or rescue the others. Just run as far and fast as you can." "Julia." "Frederick, listen to me carefully. The man I married was a mild-mannered accountant who collected stamps and worried about tax deadlines. The man who's hunting us is something entirely different. He's a professional killer who spent 20 years perfecting the art of eliminating threats. We thought we were manipulating him, but we were just mice playing in a maze he'd built around us." Julia left Frederick in the warehouse and drove toward the coordinates Bruce had provided. As Seattle's skyline disappeared in her rearview mirror, she found herself thinking about the early years of her marriage, when Bruce's carefully maintained facade had seemed genuine and their life together had felt like a fairy tale. She discovered his true nature gradually, catching glimpses of the predator beneath the accountant's surface. Phone conversations that ended abruptly when she entered rooms. Business trips that didn't match his supposed client meetings. Most revealing, The way he moved through their house at night, not like a man familiar with his surroundings, but like someone constantly assessing threats and escape routes. By the time she'd confirmed her suspicions about Bruce's criminal activities, Julia had already begun planning his elimination. Not because she was horrified by his secret life, but because she recognized the opportunity it represented. His death would give her access to wealth and power beyond anything she'd ever imagined. But now, driving toward what might be her own execution, Julia realized she'd made a fundamental error. She'd assumed that understanding Bruce's criminal activities made her his equal. She'd believed that access to his files and knowledge of his methods gave her power over him. Instead, she'd been a mouse studying a hawk, mistaking observation for understanding. Bruce had allowed her to discover his secrets, had perhaps even wanted her to find them. Every piece of evidence she'd gathered, every plan she'd made, every move against him had been anticipated and prepared for. The GPS coordinates led to an abandoned industrial complex on the shores of Puget Sound. As Julia parked her car and walked toward the designated meeting point, she wondered if this was where her former husband, had conducted his business over the years. The location was perfect for activities that required privacy and easy disposal of evidence. A figure emerged from the shadows of a loading dock. Even at a distance, Julia recognized Bruce's measured pace and controlled posture. But something had changed in the hours since she'd last seen him sleeping in their bed. The mild-mannered accountant was gone completely, replaced by someone who radiated lethal competence. "Hello, Julia," Bruce said as she approached. "We need to talk." Chapter 7. Accounts Payable. The abandoned industrial complex stretched along a quarter-mile of Puget Sound waterfront, its rusted buildings and broken windows testifying to Seattle's industrial past. Bruce had chosen the location carefully, isolated enough to prevent interruption, but close enough to the city that the sound of gunfire might be attributed to construction work or automotive backfiring. Most importantly, the deep water access made disposal of evidence extremely convenient. Julia found him waiting in what had once been the facility's main office, a cavernous space with exposed beams and broken skylights that cast geometric shadows across the concrete floor. Bruce sat behind a makeshift desk constructed from shipping pallets and plywood, reviewing files spread across its surface. He'd changed from his accountant's uniform into black tactical clothing that emphasized the predator's physique he'd hidden beneath conservative suits. "Sit," Bruce said without looking up from his papers. His voice carried an authority Julia had never heard before, the tone of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. Julia remained standing, trying to project defiance despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Where are Clay, Carrie, and Hugh?" "Safe. For now." Bruce gestured toward 3 metal chairs positioned in front of his makeshift desk. Each chair was equipped with restraints, stained with what looked suspiciously like blood. "They're experiencing a comprehensive education in the consequences of betrayal. Whether they survive that education depends largely on your cooperation." "What do you want?" Bruce finally looked up from his files, and Julia felt her breath catch. His eyes held no trace of the gentle man she'd married. What stared back at her was something ancient and pitiless, a predator that had spent decades learning how to kill efficiently and without remorse. "I want to understand," Bruce said conversationally. 12 years of marriage, Julia. 12 years of sharing a bed, building a life together, planning a future. When did you decide I needed to die? Julia forced herself to meet his gaze. "When I discovered what you really were." "And what am I, in your estimation?" "A killer. A criminal who's been murdering people for money while pretending to be a respectable accountant. Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out eventually?" Bruce smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "I counted on you figuring it out, Julia. The question is what you plan to do with that knowledge." He opened one of the files and withdrew a series of photographs. The images showed Julia and Frederick together in hotel rooms, restaurants, and private locations spanning the previous 8 months. Each photograph was time-stamped and annotated with details about their conversations. "You've been under surveillance since the day you first approached Frederick," Bruce continued. "Every meeting, every phone call, every plan you've made has been documented and recorded. I know about your scheme to eliminate me and assume control of my operations. I know about your plan to blackmail my clients. I know about Frederick's criminal network and their intention to expand into contract killing. Julia stared at the photographs with growing horror. You've been watching me for 8 months? I've been protecting my business interests. You and Frederick represented a potential threat that required monitoring and eventual elimination. The only question was when and how to neutralize you permanently. Bruce opened another file and withdrew a digital recording device. Would you like to hear some of your more interesting conversations? Perhaps the one where you discuss the most effective way to make my death look like a random home invasion? Or the session where Frederick explained how much my client list would be worth on the black market? You son of a bitch. You knew everything and let me plan your murder. I allowed you to reveal the full scope of your betrayal, Bruce corrected. Killing you after your first meeting with Frederick would have left loose ends, associates who might continue your work, plans that might be implemented by others. Better to let your conspiracy develop completely before eliminating all participants simultaneously. Julia began to understand the true scope of Bruce's manipulation. He hadn't just survived their attempt to kill him. He'd orchestrated every aspect of their plan, allowing them to believe they were hunting him while he systematically gathered evidence of their crimes. The men we hired to kill you, she said slowly. You eliminated them. Clay's associates from his security firm. Former military contractors who'd been involved in several suspicious deaths over the past 3 years. Their elimination was a public service. Bruce's voice remained conversational, as if discussing the weather. I replaced them with more suitable candidates for your purposes. The crime scene in our house was staged using the actual killers you'd hired, positioned to look like they'd died during a violent struggle with their intended victim. The police found exactly what I wanted them to find: evidence of a home invasion gone wrong, with no indication of the actual conspiracy behind it. Julia sank into one of the chairs, her mind reeling. You've been planning this for months. I've been planning this for years, Julia. The moment I recognized that my criminal activities might make me a target, I began developing contingencies for various scenarios. Your betrayal was always a possibility I prepared for. Bruce opened a third file and withdrew a comprehensive dossier on Julia's life, not just her recent activities, but everything spanning back to her childhood. Bank records, school transcripts, employment history, medical records, and most damning of all, evidence of previous relationships that had ended with her benefiting financially from her partner's misfortunes. Did you really think you were my first unfaithful wife, Julia? That I'd reached middle age without learning to recognize the signs of betrayal? Bruce's laugh was genuinely amused. You're the third woman who's tried to manipulate me for financial gain. The difference is that this time, I was prepared. The other women are no longer relevant to this conversation. What matters now is determining your fate and the fate of your conspirators. Julia's survival instincts finally overcame her shock. If you're going to kill me, just do it. Stop playing these games. Killing you would be simple, Julia, but simple solutions don't serve my broader objectives. Bruce leaned back in his chair, studying her with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. Your death needs to send a message to anyone else who might consider betraying me. It needs to be memorable, educational, and absolutely final. From somewhere in the building came the sound of muffled screaming, brief but unmistakably human. Julia's blood turned to ice as she recognized Clay's voice. As I mentioned, your friends are receiving an education in accountability, Bruce said. Clay is learning about the consequences of using his security firm to target his former teammates. Carrie is discovering what happens to people who abuse their military connections for criminal purposes. Hugh is being reminded why betraying trust in our profession is traditionally a capital offense. You're torturing them. I'm extracting information about their other criminal activities while ensuring they understand the gravity of their mistakes. The process is thorough. Another scream echoed through the building, this one clearly coming from Hugh. Julia pressed her hands to her ears, but Bruce continued speaking in the same conversational tone. Each of them believed they were clever enough to manipulate me. Clay thought his surveillance skills made him invisible. Carrie assumed his import connections gave him leverage over my operations. Hugh imagined his law enforcement contacts would protect him from consequences. They were all wrong. Bruce opened a fourth file and withdrew a detailed organizational chart showing connections between Julia, Frederick, Clay, Carrie, Hugh, and dozens of other individuals. The chart revealed a criminal network far more extensive than Julia had realized. One that included corrupt officials, international smugglers, and professional killers operating across multiple countries. Your conspiracy wasn't limited to eliminating me and stealing my business, Bruce continued. You were planning to become the American branch of an international crime syndicate. Frederick's connections reach from Seattle to Singapore, involving people who traffic in weapons, drugs, and human beings. Your plan was to use my death as your entry into that world. Julia stared at the chart in growing horror. She'd known Frederick had criminal connections, but the scope of his network was breathtaking. I didn't know about most of this. Ignorance isn't a defense, Julia. You chose to ally yourself with people whose business model involves systematic violence and exploitation. Your motivations don't change the consequences of your actions. Bruce stood and walked to one of the broken windows overlooking Puget Sound. In the distance, Seattle's skyline gleamed in the afternoon sun, a reminder of the normal world that existed beyond this chamber of judgment. Here's what's going to happen, Bruce said without turning around. You're going to provide me with complete information about Frederick's organization, including names, locations, and operational details. You're going to give me access to all financial accounts, communication systems, and safe houses. And you're going to do it quickly, because my patience for this situation is extremely limited. And if I cooperate, then your death will be quick and professional rather than prolonged and educational. The words hit Julia like a physical blow. Despite everything that had happened, some part of her had still hoped for mercy, for forgiveness, for a chance to escape the consequences of her betrayal. There's no way out of this, is there? Bruce turned from the window and looked at her with something that might have been pity. Julia, you hired men to kill me in my sleep. You planned to profit from my death and destroy innocent people in the process. You allied yourself with criminals who traffic in human misery. Did you really expect forgiveness? From the depths of the building came another scream, this one from Carrie. The sound lasted longer this time, filled with agony and desperation that made Julia's stomach clench with nausea. Make your choice, Bruce said, returning to his desk. Cooperation followed by a quick death, or resistance followed by an education that will make your friend's current experience seem pleasant by comparison. Julia looked at the files spread across Bruce's makeshift desk, each one representing a life he'd systematically cataloged and prepared to destroy. She thought about Frederick, probably already dead or wishing he was. She thought about the 3 men she'd convinced to betray their oldest friend, now paying the ultimate price for their greed and betrayal. Most of all, she thought about the man she'd married, the gentle accountant who'd worried about tax deadlines and collected stamps. That man had never existed. What sat across from her was something far more dangerous, a professional killer who'd spent 12 years studying her weaknesses and preparing for her betrayal. I'll tell you everything, Julia whispered. Bruce smiled and opened a fresh notebook. Excellent. Let's begin with Frederick's financial arrangements. I want account numbers, access codes, and the location of his liquid assets. As Julia began providing the information that would destroy the criminal network she'd allied herself with, she realized that Bruce's revenge was more comprehensive than simple murder. He was systematically dismantling everything she'd worked to build, ensuring that her betrayal would result in the complete destruction of everyone and everything she'd valued. The mild-mannered accountant was gone forever. What remained was a predator who understood that true vengeance required more than death. It required the absolute and permanent elimination of every trace of those who'd betrayed him. Outside the broken windows, Seattle's skyline gleamed in the afternoon sun, unaware that several of its citizens were experiencing their final hours of life in an abandoned building on the shore of Puget Sound. Chapter 8. Final Audit. The confession took 3 hours. Julia provided details about Frederick's criminal network with the mechanical precision of someone who understood that cooperation was her only hope for a merciful death. Bruce recorded everything, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting additional details about specific operations, but mostly listening with the patient attention of a professional gathering intelligence. By sunset, he possessed a complete understanding of the conspiracy against him and the broader criminal organization it was connected to. Frederick's network included corrupt officials in 6 countries, smuggling operations that moved everything from weapons to human trafficking victims, and a client base of wealthy individuals who paid premium prices for absolute discretion in their illegal activities. That's everything, Julia said finally, her voice hoarse from hours of talking. "Every account, every contact, every operation I know about." Bruce reviewed his notes with methodical care, occasionally cross-referencing details against files he'd compiled during months of surveillance. The intelligence Julia had provided would be invaluable for eliminating Frederick's entire organization. Dozens of criminals who would never see justice through traditional law enforcement channels. "Thank you for your cooperation," Bruce said. "Your information will ensure that Frederick's associates meet appropriate consequences for their crimes." "What about me?" Julia asked. "You said my death would be quick if I cooperated. And it will be. But first, there's one more matter to address." Bruce opened a final file and withdrew a document that made Julia's blood freeze. Her original birth certificate, listing her real name as Marina Volkov, daughter of Russian immigrants who'd changed their identities after fleeing their homeland in 1987. The document was followed by photographs showing Julia at various ages, including images from her previous marriages to men who died under suspicious circumstances. "Did you really think I'd marry someone without conducting a thorough background investigation?" Bruce asked conversationally. "Julia Bean Taylor is a carefully constructed identity you've been using for 13 years. Before that, you were Maria Santos, widow of a wealthy rancher who died in a convenient riding accident. Before that, you were Michelle Chun, whose husband suffered a fatal heart attack despite having no history of cardiac problems." Julia stared at the evidence of her past with growing horror. "How long have you known?" "Since our third date. I was impressed by the sophistication of your identity construction. Multiple layers of documentation, carefully placed references, even manufactured social connections. You'd clearly done this before." Bruce opened another section of the file, revealing financial records that traced Julia's assets across multiple identities and jurisdictions. "Each husband provided you with substantial wealth before dying unexpectedly. The rancher's life insurance paid out $4 million. The businessman's investments were worth $7 million when he passed. You've been murdering wealthy men for their money for over 15 years. Then why did you marry me?" "Because you represented a unique opportunity," Bruce replied. "A professional criminal who didn't know she was living with another professional criminal. I wanted to study your methods, understand your psychology, and ultimately use your skills for my own purposes." Julia's mind reeled as she processed the implications. "You've been using me. We've been using each other, Julia. You thought you'd found another wealthy victim to manipulate and murder. I knew I'd found someone with experience in identity manipulation and staged deaths, skills that proved valuable for my legitimate business operations." Bruce withdrew a series of photographs showing Julia at various crime scenes over the years, always in the background, always with an alibi, but consistently present when convenient deaths occurred. "You helped me eliminate several problematic clients without realizing it. Your presence at social events provided perfect cover for operations that might otherwise have attracted unwanted attention. You manipulated me into helping you kill people. I provided opportunities for you to do what you do naturally, be present when wealthy, powerful men died unexpectedly. The difference is that my targets deserve their fates, while yours were simply convenient sources of income." Another scream echoed through the building, this one weaker than the previous ones. Julia flinched at the sound, recognizing that one of her conspirators was reaching the limits of human endurance. "They're dying, aren't they?" she asked. "They're paying for their crimes," Bruce corrected. "Clay has confessed to 17 murders committed through his security firm over the past 5 years. Carey's import business has been a front for human trafficking, moving enslaved women and children across international borders. Hugh has been selling law enforcement intelligence to criminals, enabling them to evade justice for decades." Bruce showed her photographs taken during the interrogations, images that revealed the true scope of his former friend's criminal activities. Each man had used their legitimate professions as cover for systematic violence and exploitation. "I trusted them," Bruce continued, his voice hardening. "I served with them, bled with them, saved their lives, and had mine saved by them. They repaid that trust by allying themselves with you and Frederick to orchestrate my murder. What are you going to do to me?" Bruce stood and walked to a table where he'd arranged an assortment of tools that looked like they belonged in a surgeon's kit. Each instrument was clean, sharp, and designed for precision work on human anatomy. "I'm going to give you a choice, Julia. You can die quickly and professionally, with your body positioned to support the narrative that you were killed by Frederick's associates as part of a criminal dispute. Or you can join your friends in the educational process, learning firsthand about the consequences of betraying people who trust you. Julia looked at the tools, then at Bruce, then at the files documenting her crimes spanning 15 years. For the first time since her first kill, she felt genuine fear, not the excitement of danger or the thrill of manipulation, but absolute terror at facing someone more dangerous than herself. "The quick death," she whispered. "I thought you might choose that option." Bruce selected a small, precise-looking instrument from his collection. "Before we proceed, there's one last thing I need you to understand." He opened a final file and withdrew photographs of a woman Julia didn't recognize, an attractive brunette in her 30s, laughing at some unseen joke. The woman wore a wedding ring and stood next to a man whose face had been carefully obscured in every image. "Her name was Sarah Mitchell," Bruce said quietly. "She was my first wife, before I created the Bruce Taylor identity. We were married for 3 years before she was killed in what appeared to be a random home invasion." Julia stared at the photographs, beginning to understand the true depth of Bruce's motivation. The investigation revealed that Sarah had been targeted by someone who discovered my military background and thought they could use her death to manipulate me. They were wrong. Sarah's murder taught me that people I loved would always be vulnerable to my enemies. It also taught me that some betrayals require permanent solutions. Bruce replaced the photographs and looked at Julia with eyes that held 20 years of carefully controlled rage. "You're not the first person to try to use my personal relationships against me, Julia. But you'll be the last. I never knew about Sarah. Because I learned from her death. I learned to compartmentalize my life, to maintain operational security, and most importantly, to ensure that anyone who threatened the people I cared about faced absolute and final consequences." Bruce picked up the instrument he'd selected earlier, a thin, sharp blade designed for precision cuts. "Sarah was innocent. She died because someone wanted to hurt me. You, on the other hand, are a serial killer who spent 15 years murdering innocent men for their money. Your death serves justice as well as vengeance." Julia closed her eyes and tried to summon the courage that had carried her through a lifetime of dangerous deceptions. "Just make it quick. Open your eyes, Julia. I want you to see this coming." She opened her eyes and found Bruce standing directly in front of her, the blade held with professional competence. His face showed no emotion, not anger, not satisfaction, not even displeasure. What she saw was the complete absence of human feeling, the perfect detachment of someone who'd killed so many times that death had become a simple mechanical process. "Goodbye, Julia," Bruce said quietly. The blade moved with surgical precision, finding the exact point where it would cause maximum damage with minimum suffering. Julia felt a moment of sharp pain, then spreading warmth, then nothing at all. Bruce checked her pulse to confirm death, then began the methodical process of staging her body to support the narrative he'd constructed. By the time he finished, the scene would tell a clear story. Julia Taylor had been murdered by associates of Frederick Lawson as part of a criminal dispute over money and territory. From deeper in the building came silence. Clay, Carrie, and Hugh had finished paying for their betrayals. Bruce gathered his files, equipment, and recording devices, ensuring no evidence remained that might contradict the official story. In 6 hours, anonymous tips would direct police to the warehouse, where they would discover the bodies of 4 criminals who'd apparently killed each other in a dispute over stolen money. The mild-mannered accountant named Bruce Taylor would be mourned as the innocent victim of a home invasion. His widow's tragic murder would be attributed to her unfortunate involvement with criminals who'd targeted her husband. The case would be closed within a month, with no investigation into the true circumstances behind the deaths. But the predator who'd learned his craft in the mountains of Afghanistan would disappear forever, leaving no traces, no connections, and no loose ends that might threaten his next identity. As Bruce prepared to leave the warehouse, he paused at one of the broken windows overlooking Puget Sound. Seattle's skyline glittered in the darkness, beautiful and completely unaware that several of its citizens had just experienced justice of a kind that no court could provide. 20 years of carefully maintained balance between his 2 lives was ending. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of becoming someone new, someone with no history, no connections, and no vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. But tonight, He allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Everyone who'd betrayed him was dead. Everyone who'd threatened innocent people in pursuit of criminal profit had faced appropriate consequences. The world was a marginally safer place. That would have to be enough. Chapter 9. New Beginnings. 6 months later, the man who'd once been Bruce Taylor sat in a small cafe in Prague, reviewing financial newspapers and sipping coffee that cost more than most people earned in a day. To anyone observing, he appeared to be exactly what his documents claimed. Dr. David Chun, a semi-retired investment consultant enjoying an extended European vacation while managing a modest portfolio of international clients. The transformation had been complete and methodical. Bruce Taylor's identity had died with him in that Seattle warehouse, along with every connection to his previous life. Bank accounts had been emptied and routed through channels that made them untraceable. Business relationships had been quietly terminated with no forwarding addresses. The mild-mannered accountant had simply vanished, leaving behind only a tragic story of a man murdered by criminals who targeted his unfaithful wife. The Prague morning was crisp and clear, perfect for the kind of contemplative mood that had settled over him since completing his metamorphosis. The man who'd been Bruce Taylor, and before that, Sergeant Whitmore of the 22nd SAS, felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: peace. His phone buzzed with a text from a number that wasn't saved in his contacts. Package delivered as requested. Client satisfied with results. Additional services available upon request. He deleted the message without responding. The network he'd built over 2 decades continued functioning despite his official death, managed by carefully selected associates who understood the importance of discretion and results. His former clients would never know their service provider had changed. They would simply continue receiving the specialized assistance they required. But David Chun had no interest in continuing Bruce Taylor's profession. The accumulated wealth from 20 years of specialized consulting was more than sufficient for any conceivable lifestyle. More importantly, the systematic elimination of everyone who'd betrayed him had closed the final chapter of a story that had begun in the mountains of Afghanistan. The revenge he'd taken hadn't been limited to Julia and her conspirators. Over the 6 months since their deaths, anonymous tips had reached law enforcement agencies in 12 countries, providing evidence that dismantled Frederick's entire criminal network. Corrupt officials had been arrested, smuggling operations had been exposed, and dozens of criminals had found themselves facing justice they'd thought themselves immune to. The human trafficking operation Carey had helped manage was shut down permanently, with its victims freed and its operators facing life sentences. Hugh's network of corrupt law enforcement contacts had been exposed through carefully leaked evidence, resulting in the largest police corruption scandal in Seattle's history. Clay's security firm had been revealed as a front for contract killing, leading to the investigation and arrest of everyone involved in its operations. None of the survivors would ever connect their downfall to the mild-mannered accountant who died in a home invasion 6 months earlier. To them, it would appear that someone, perhaps a rival criminal organization, had systematically gathered evidence of their activities and used it to destroy them through official channels. David Chun smiled as he read about the latest arrests in the international newspaper. Justice delayed was still justice, even when it came through unconventional channels. His reflection was interrupted by the arrival of someone he hadn't expected to see again. Clay Lynn, or rather, someone who bore a striking resemblance to his former teammate. The man approaching his table was thinner than Clay had been, with surgical scars that suggested extensive medical intervention, but his eyes were unmistakably those of someone who'd shared foxholes in Afghanistan 20 years earlier. "Hello, Bruce," the man said quietly, taking the seat across from him without invitation. David Chin's expression didn't change, but his mind immediately began calculating distances, angles, and potential weapons within reach. "I think you have me confused with someone else. My name is David Chun." "The scars are excellent work," Clay continued, ignoring the denial. "Facial reconstruction, dental work, even surgical modification of your fingerprints. But you can't change your eyes, and you can't change the way you move. I'd recognize you anywhere." David maintained his calm expression while assessing the threat level. Clay's presence suggested either remarkable luck or careful planning. Given their shared history, planning was more likely. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "You're wondering how I survived?" Clay said. "The answer is that I didn't." Clay Lynn died in that warehouse, along with Carrie and Hugh. What sits across from you is something different. Someone who learned from his mistakes and chose a more productive path forward. David raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. The interrogation you subjected me to was educational, Clay continued. It taught me that my priorities had become corrupted, that I'd lost sight of what actually mattered. The experience of facing death for my betrayals was clarifying in ways I hadn't expected. And what did it clarify? That the man I'd served with in Afghanistan deserved better than what I'd given him. That loyalty is more valuable than money. And that some mistakes require lifetime atonement to correct. Clay opened a briefcase and withdrew a file folder that he placed on the table between them. These are the locations of 3 remaining cells from Frederick's organization, groups that escaped the net you cast 6 months ago. They're still operational, still trafficking in human misery, still profiting from violence and exploitation. David glanced at the folder but didn't touch it. Why would I be interested in that information? Because they represent unfinished business. Because innocent people are suffering while these criminals operate with impunity. And because I know you well enough to understand that your sense of justice won't let that continue. You're assuming I'm someone I'm not. Clay smiled for the first time since sitting down. Bruce, we served together for 8 years. I know how you think, how you plan, how you operate. You didn't just eliminate the people who betrayed you. You dismantled their entire network to ensure no one else would be victimized by their crimes. These 3 cells represent loose ends that need tying up. David finally picked up the folder and glanced through its contents. The intelligence was comprehensive and current, detailing operations in Bangkok, Marseille, and Mexico City that were directly connected to Frederick's former organization. Hundreds of victims were being trafficked through these networks, generating millions in profits for criminals who operated beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement. Even if I were this Bruce person you think I am, David said carefully, what would you expect in return for this information? Nothing, Clay replied. This is an attempt at redemption, not a transaction. I owe a debt that can never be fully repaid, but I can at least try to balance the scales slightly. And if I were to act on this information, then you'd have the assistance of someone who understands your methods and shares your commitment to results. I've spent 6 months preparing for this moment, gathering intelligence, establishing resources, and eliminating my own past connections that might compromise operations. Clay opened his jacket slightly, revealing surgical scars that suggested he'd undergone the same kind of comprehensive identity reconstruction that had transformed Bruce into David. I'm not Clay Lynn anymore, any more than you're Bruce Taylor. We're both ghosts now, free to operate without the constraints of our previous lives. David studied his former teammate's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agendas. What he saw was something he hadn't expected, genuine remorse, combined with the professional competence he remembered from their military service. Why should I trust you? Because I've already proven my commitment to this path. 6 weeks ago, I eliminated the last 3 members of my former security firm, men who were continuing the criminal activities I'd started. 2 weeks ago, I provided evidence to Interpol that led to the arrest of arms dealers in Eastern Europe. Last week, I rescued 17 trafficking victims from a compound in Montenegro. Clay withdrew his phone and showed David a series of photographs documenting the operations he'd described. The evidence was convincing and corroborated details David had read in international news reports. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Clay continued. I'm asking for the opportunity to spend whatever time I have left making amends for what I've done. You taught me that some betrayals require permanent consequences. I'm trying to ensure those consequences benefit innocent people rather than simply satisfying vengeance. David closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, considering the proposal. The intelligence Clay had provided was valuable, but acting on it would require resources, planning, and skills that would be difficult to manage alone. More importantly, it would mean abandoning the peaceful retirement he'd planned in favor of continuing the dangerous work that had defined his adult life. But the photographs in Clay's phone showed faces that haunted anyone with a conscience. Children and young adults whose lives had been destroyed by the criminal networks Frederick had helped establish. Ignoring their suffering would make David complicit in their continued victimization. If we were to work together, David said finally, it would be under my operational control. No independent initiatives, no personal agendas, no deviation from established protocols. Clay nodded. Understood. And if you betray me again, even slightly, your death will be far more creative than what you experienced in that warehouse. Also understood. David finished his coffee and stood up, leaving money on the table to cover the bill. Give me 72 hours to review your intelligence and develop operational plans. If I decide to proceed, I'll contact you using the number in this folder. And if you decide not to proceed, then David Chun will continue his European vacation, and you'll find other ways to balance your moral accounts. As David walked away from the cafe, he reflected on the unexpected turn his new life had taken. 6 months ago, he believed his violent career was ending with the elimination of everyone who'd betrayed him. Now he faced the possibility of continuing that work under different circumstances, with different motivations, and potentially with the assistance of someone who'd once been his enemy. The irony wasn't lost on him. Clay's attempt at redemption might lead to David's return to the profession he'd tried to leave behind. But if that return meant protecting innocent people from criminals who operated beyond the reach of justice, perhaps it would serve a purpose more meaningful than simple vengeance. In his hotel room that evening, David spread Clay's intelligence across his desk and began the methodical process of analyzing targets, resources, and operational requirements. The work was familiar and oddly comforting, a return to the problem-solving skills that had kept him alive for 2 decades. By morning, he would have a decision. By next week, he might be back in the business of eliminating threats that traditional law enforcement couldn't touch. The mild-mannered accountant named Bruce Taylor was dead and buried. But perhaps it was time for David Chun to discover what kind of man he was meant to become. Outside his window, Prague's ancient spires caught the last light of sunset, beautiful and eternal. Somewhere in the darkness, innocent people suffered while criminals profited from their pain. David Chun picked up his phone and began making calls to old contacts who might assist with new operations. Retirement, it seemed, would have to wait. The hunt was about to begin again.